The contraction hit at 11:52 p.m., and it folded me over the counter hard enough to knock a coffee pot out of my hand. It didn't break. I did, a little. Not enough to make a sound. I had gotten very good in the last 8 months at not making a sound. Table 6 needs a refill, Ren, not a floor show. Doreen said it without looking up from the register, the way she said most things to me lately, like I was furniture that occasionally moved on its own. I gripped the counter's edge and breathed until the vise around my spine let go, counted it the way the app on my cracked phone had taught me, 40 seconds, longer than the last one, closer than the last one, and by the time I straightened, Grant was standing in the doorway with the bell still swinging behind him. He hadn't come for me. I knew that in the half second before he opened his mouth, the way you know a storm has already turned before the sky confirms it. "I need the truck title," he said. "The blue one. It's got my name on it, too." 8 months. 8 months since he'd looked at the second pink line on the test in my shaking hands and told me, calmly, like he was declining a second helping, that he wasn't built for this, and walked out of an apartment I could no longer afford alone. 8 months, and the first thing out of his mouth wasn't a question about the due date. It was a truck title. "It's in the glove box," I said, "where it's always been. You could have called. You could have stayed." My voice didn't shake. I was almost proud of that. Later, when I had time to be proud of anything, 2 men at the counter had stopped eating to watch, the way people watch a car that's already crashed, useless and fascinated. Doreen's mouth had gone thin and flat, the look she got when a scene threatened her tip average. "You're being dramatic," Grant said, and something in my stomach clenched that had nothing to do with drama at all. A low, deliberate tightening, like a fist closing around a rope. I put my hand flat on the counter. I did not make a sound. "Get the title and go. Grant, he got it. He went." The bell rang twice, once for him leaving, once 10 minutes later for Doreen following me into the back to tell me that if I was going to have a moment, I should have it on my own time, and that she needed me for the late rush, and that she was sorry, in the specific tone people use when they are not sorry at all. My name is Ren Ashby. I was 27 years old, 6 days from my due date, according to a doctor I'd seen exactly twice because I didn't have insurance that covered more, and the second contraction, when it came at 12:14, was strong enough that I had to sit down on an overturned bus tub in the walk-in cooler and put both hands over my mouth. I want to tell you I was scared. I was. But underneath the fear was something colder and more familiar, the sense, worn smooth from years of handling, that whatever happened next, I would handle it the way I'd handled everything since I was 22 years old, and had walked into a hospital finance office with a folder of numbers that didn't add up, and walked out 3 weeks later with no job, no references, and a very clear understanding that some kinds of competence get you punished instead of praised. I hadn't touched a spreadsheet in 5 years. I told myself I never would again. The body remembers what the mind buries, though, and mine had spent 8 months quietly, uselessly cataloging every mistake, every crooked column, every number that didn't sit right, including, though I didn't know it yet, the ones in the building I was about to walk into. Sterling Memorial was 14 blocks from the diner. I did not have bus fare and cab fare both. I chose the walk because the bus didn't come for 11 minutes and my body had started keeping its own schedule, one that didn't care about timetables. I made it 9 blocks before my water broke on the sidewalk outside a shuttered flower shop, warm and sudden and final, and something in me that had been holding very still for 8 months simply stopped pretending it could hold anymore. A rideshare got me the rest of the way. The driver did not stop talking the entire ride, which I was grateful for, because it meant I didn't have to. I paid him with the last of the cash in my coat pocket and walked into the lobby of Sterling Memorial at 12:41 a.m., alone, doubled over every 90 seconds, and asked the woman at the desk for the elevator to labor and delivery, because the stairs, at that point, might as well have been a mountain. "Fourth floor," she said, already reaching for a phone. "I'll call ahead. I didn't hear the rest." The doors of elevator 3 slid open, and I stepped inside, and a stranger in a plain gray coat stepped in half a second behind me, and the doors closed, and the lights buzzed once, hard, like a held breath. The car dropped an inch. Then it stopped. Between the 3rd and 4th floor, at 12:43 a.m., the elevator went dark except for a single amber emergency light, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that I was going to have this baby in a box the size of a closet with a stranger for company. The stranger didn't scream. She didn't hit the alarm and wait. She crouched, in one clean motion, coat pooling around her knees, and looked at me with a steadiness that cut straight through the panic climbing my throat. "How far apart?" she said. Not a question, a demand, delivered so calmly it sounded like a kindness. 2 minutes. Maybe less. My voice cracked on the second word. I'm not supposed to. You're not supposed to do this alone in an elevator. No, you're not. She was already shrugging out of the gray coat, folding it into a pad against the wall behind me, guiding me down onto it with 2 firm hands, no hesitation in either of them. "But you're not alone now. Look at me. Not the door." Me. I looked at her. In the amber light, she was all plains and shadow. Dark hair pulled back hard enough to mean business. A scent rolling off her that I would spend the rest of my life able to name in a single breath. Black tea and rain on slate, cold and steady. The smell of a person who did not panic, because panic had never once solved anything for her. "I'm Ren," I said, because it seemed important, suddenly, that she know my name before whatever was about to happen happened. "Marlowe." She had already pushed up my sleeve, 2 fingers at my wrist, counting. Her mouth moved slightly with the numbers. "Marlowe, and I've done this before, and you're going to do exactly what I tell you, and it's going to be fine. Can you do that? Do I have a choice?" Something that was almost a smile crossed her face, there and gone. "Everyone has a choice. You're just going to choose right." She pressed the emergency call button, got a burst of static and a promise that a team was coming, that the elevator had lost power building wide, that it could be minutes, could be longer. Her jaw tightened at that, 1 degree, controlled. She didn't let it reach her hands. "Emergency lighting's on backup. Backup doesn't last, so we're not waiting for them. We're doing this now." I don't remember all of it in order. I remember the cold of the elevator floor through her coat. I remember her voice, low and even, narrating each thing before she did it so nothing came as a surprise. "I'm going to check you now. I'm going to need you to breathe with me. I'm not going anywhere. Look at me, Ren. Look at me." And I remember that at 1:09 a.m., by the light of a dying emergency bulb, between the 3rd and 4th floors of a hospital I did not know I was about to learn everything about, my daughter was born into the steady hands of a stranger who had not once, in 26 minutes, raised her voice. She was small and furious and alive, and the sound she made split the silence of that stalled car wide open, and I started to cry the way you cry when a held breath finally lets go all at once. Marlowe set her against my chest, guided my hands into place with hers still shaking, just slightly, just once, the only crack in 26 minutes of steel, and something in me registered, distantly, beneath the wreckage of adrenaline and relief, a second scent under the first, warm and impossibly gentle, clover honey and clean cotton, and I understood it was mine, and that she could smell it too, and that she was looking at me like she'd just watched something she didn't have a word for. "You did that," Marlo said quietly. "Not me. You did the hard part." The lights came back on with a lurch at 1:22 a.m. The car groaned, shuddered, and began to climb, and somewhere above us I heard voices, running feet, the metal clang of doors being forced. Marlo didn't move. She stayed crouched in front of me, one hand braced against the wall like she meant to hold the whole car up herself if she had to, and it was only when the doors finally split open on the 4th floor onto a wall of scrub-clad staff and stretchers and shouted vitals that I heard someone say her name in full, with a kind of reverence that didn't match the plain gray coat now soaked through and ruined on the floor behind us. "Dr. Sterling. My God, is that, sir? Is she? She's Dr. Sterling," someone else said. "Low, urgent. That's Dr. Sterling." I looked at the woman who had just delivered my daughter with her bare, steady hands, and I said, stupidly, through the fog of exhaustion, "Sterling, like the hospital?" Marlo's eyes met mine over the chaos closing in around us, and for the first time since the doors had shut on us both, something like discomfort moved across her face. "Like the hospital," she said. "We'll talk about that later." Then the stretcher was under me, and the ceiling was moving, and the last thing I saw before they wheeled me through a set of doors marked Private Suite, Authorized Access Only, was Marlo Sterling standing very still in the hallway, watching us go, one hand pressed flat against her own sternum like she was checking that her heart was still doing its job. I woke in a room that did not belong to a woman who worked diner shifts for $11 an hour. The light was low and gold, not fluorescent. There was a window, an actual window, with actual daylight coming through it, gauzy curtains instead of a blind with a broken slat. The blanket over my legs was heavier than any hospital blanket had a right to be, soft in a way that made my throat tighten for reasons that had nothing to do with childbirth. In a bassinet beside the bed, wrapped in white, my daughter slept with one fist against her cheek, and I lay there for a long moment just listening to her breathe, before a nurse noticed my eyes were open and went very still. "You're awake," she said, and then, quieter, almost to herself, "Oh, thank goodness, she'll want to know. Where am I?" "East Wing, Private Suite." The nurse, Priya, according to the tag pinned crooked to her scrubs, checked a monitor, adjusted something, and did not quite meet my eyes. This floor's usually reserved for board members, donors, people who... She stopped herself. "People who aren't me." I finished. "Priya had the decency to look embarrassed," Dr. Sterling asked personally. "Said you weren't to be moved unless you wanted to be. A beat." For what it's worth, in 9 years here, I've never seen her ask for anything personally. Not once. I found out the rest of it in pieces over the next 2 days, the way you find out a house is on fire, first a smell, then a sound, then the whole shape of it all at once. Sterling Memorial wasn't named after some dead philanthropist 3 generations removed. Marlo Sterling was the Sterling. Chief of trauma surgery when she wanted to be, chair of the board the rest of the time, sole controlling owner of a hospital system that spanned 4 states, and, according to Priya, delivered in a scandalized whisper while changing an IV bag, a woman the staff had taken to calling, not to her face, the Sterling widow, because 6 years ago her wife had died on an operating table 2 floors above the room I was lying in, and Marlo had not so much as dated since. I turned that word over for a long time. Widow. It didn't fit the woman who had held my hand and counted my pulse in the dark like the math itself could keep me safe. She visited that evening, in scrubs this time instead of the ruined gray coat, carrying a paper bag that turned out to hold orange slices, Not grapes, not the sad hospital gelatin cup on my tray, but oranges, peeled and sectioned. Because somewhere in 26 minutes of labor I had apparently mentioned, deliriously, that all I wanted in the world was an orange, and she had remembered. "You didn't have to do that," I said, and meant the room, the food, all of it. "I know." She set the bag down, glanced at the bassinet, and something in her face softened in a way I was starting to recognize as rare. "She's got a good set of lungs. Woke half the floor at 3. She takes after her mother." I meant it as a joke. It landed somewhere heavier. Marlowe's eyes came back to mine and held there a second too long, and I felt my pulse climb the way it had in the elevator, not from fear this time. "Ren," she said my name like she was testing its weight. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know you can say no." "Okay, there's a man downstairs. Says he's the father. Says his name's on the birth paperwork whether he was there or not." Her jaw tightened, the same controlled degree from the elevator. "Security's holding him at the desk. I can have him removed from the building entirely, or I can let him up, if that's what you want. Your choice, not mine." I thought of Grant's voice in the diner doorway, the truck title, 8 months of silence broken only by that. "Send him away," I said, and it came out steadier than I expected. He gave up the right to be in this room a long time before today. Something eased in Marlowe's shoulders, a fraction, controlled the way everything about her was controlled. "Good answer," she said. And I caught, for just a second, the corner of her mouth doing something that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be one. She stayed another 20 minutes. She didn't need to. There was, I would learn, no medical reason for the owner of a 4-state hospital system to sit in a plastic chair beside a diner waitress's bed, asking whether the pillows were flat enough, whether the orange slices were sweet enough, whether I needed anything else, anything at all, and meaning it every time she asked. On the 3rd day, a man in a suit that cost more than my rent came to the door without knocking, glanced at me the way you'd glance at a stain on someone else's carpet, and asked Priya, not me, how long the unassigned patient would be occupying a donor suite. "She has a name," Marlowe said from the doorway, in a voice so quiet it made the man in the suit flinch harder than shouting would have. "Ren Ashby. And she'll be here as long as I say she is. Dorian, you have somewhere else to be." He left. But not before his eyes swept over me one more time, cold and assessing, cataloging, the way I remembered cataloging budget lines that didn't add up 5 years ago, in a job I'd lost for looking too closely at exactly that kind of arithmetic. Something in my chest went tight and watchful and did not let go for the rest of the day. I didn't know his name yet. Not really. Not what it meant. I only knew that Marlowe Sterling had said it like a wall going up, and that the wall had been built, I would come to understand, one funeral at a time. She told me on the 4th night, when the lights of the city were coming up gold and blue against the window, and Iris, I'd named her that morning, for no reason but that it was the first word that had felt like it belonged to no one but us, was finally, blessedly asleep. "You want to know why I was in that elevator," Marlowe said. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the window, at her own reflection ghosted over the skyline. Off duty. Not on call. Nowhere I needed to be at 12:40 in the morning. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. I go up to the roof garden on the 9th floor. Once a month, sometimes more. A pause, careful, like she was setting down something breakable. There's a bench up there with a plaque on it. My wife's name is on the plaque. Eleanor, she was a resident here 6 years ago, 31 years old, and she died on a table 2 floors above your room because a supply order for a specific clotting agent came in short, and nobody caught it in time, and by the time anyone did, it didn't matter. Her hands, folded in her lap, went very still. The internal review said human error, attending fatigue, something forgettable and blameless. I bought this hospital 18 months later. I told myself it was so it would never happen again. I've spent 6 years making sure of exactly that, and I still go up to that bench once a month because making sure isn't the same thing as making it not have happened. I didn't say I was sorry. It felt too small for what she'd handed me. Instead, I said, "That's why you didn't panic." In the elevator. I don't have a choice about panicking anymore. I used it up. She finally looked at me, and the steadiness in her eyes had a crack running clean through the center of it, one she'd let me see on purpose. I haven't held anyone's hand through anything since her. Not once. Not until 3 nights ago, in the dark, with a stranger who kept apologizing for bleeding on my coat. I did apologize for that. You did, repeatedly. It was the strangest thing anyone said to me in 6 years. A ghost of a smile, real this time, there and staying a beat longer than the last one. I don't know what this is, Ren. I want to be honest about that. I'm not a woman who does things without knowing what they are first. But I know I haven't left this building in 4 days, and I own 11 of them. The door opened before I could answer, and Priya came in fast enough that whatever had been building between us folded itself away, quiet and unfinished, into the space where it would have to wait. "Miss Ashby," Priya's voice had a different register than usual, tight at the edges. "There's a man downstairs refusing to leave the lobby. Says he has a legal right to see his daughter. Security's called it up twice." Marlowe was already standing, jaw set, the softness of a moment ago folding itself back behind the same wall Dorian Vance had run into 3 days earlier. "He doesn't get up here," she said. "Not to this floor, not near her. He's saying it's a custody matter. He's saying he'll call a lawyer." Priya hesitated. "He's saying, Dr. Sterling, he's saying you're keeping her here against her will, that he's going to make it public." Marlowe's eyes didn't leave mine. "Is he?" she said, very quietly. "And is that true?" "No," I said, and it came out fierce enough to surprise me. "It's not true, and he knows it's not true, and he's saying it because he found out whose hospital this is and he smells money." Something moved behind Marlowe's eyes, cold and precise, the look I would learn that made board members reschedule meetings. "Then we'll make sure everyone downstairs hears exactly that," she said, and walked out the door into the hallway light, and I lay in that expensive bed with my daughter asleep in the bassinet beside me and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with fear this time, that the storm I'd been bracing for my whole pregnancy had finally arrived, and that for the first time in 8 months, I wasn't going to face it alone. Grant didn't get past the 4th floor security desk. I heard about it secondhand, in fragments, the way you hear about weather that's already passed. Marlowe standing in the lobby in scrubs at 11 at night, voice never rising, informing him in front of 2 off-duty officers picking up coffee that the birth certificate wasn't filed yet, that paternity wasn't legal fact until it was signed, and that he was welcome to sign it the moment he covered 8 months of support he hadn't paid a cent toward. He left. He came back twice more over the following week, each time louder, each time turned away faster, until on the 3rd attempt he made the mistake of grabbing a security guard's arm hard enough to leave a mark, and Marlowe had him escorted out with a trespass notice that would, I later learned, follow him to every Sterling-owned building in the state. I should have felt only relief. I did, mostly, but underneath it sat something colder, something I recognized from years back and hadn't let myself look at directly since. The particular, precise anger of watching a man with no real claim throw noise at a problem, when the real threat in the building wore a suit that cost 4 figures and had never once raised his voice. Dorian Vance came to see me alone on the 7th day, while Marlo was in a board meeting she couldn't get out of. He didn't knock. Again, he didn't need to. The suite door was standing open for the morning nurse round, and he simply walked in like he owned the air. "Miss Ashby." He said my name the way you'd handle something slightly dirty. I wanted to introduce myself properly. Dorian Vance, Chief Financial Officer, Chairman of the Board. I've been with this hospital for 19 years. Congratulations, his mouth flickered, not quite a smile. I also wanted to check in on you. Financially, this suite runs $8,000 a night. I assume Dr. Sterling explained that none of it's being billed to you. She mentioned it wasn't a problem. It isn't. For her. He walked to the window, hands folded behind his back, and looked out over the city like a man surveying land he intended to buy. You should understand something about Marlo. She does this. Takes in strays. A nurse who lost her housing 2 years ago, still on payroll in a job that doesn't exist. A janitor's son, full scholarship, never asked twice. It's a pattern, Miss Ashby. Grief looks for somewhere to put itself, and you happened to be standing in an elevator when hers went looking. It was engineered to hurt, and it did. A clean, precise cut that found exactly where I was softest. But something in the specific cruelty of it, strays, said with that particular clinical distaste, snagged on something older in me, a half-buried instinct that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with 5 years of reading people who lie for a living. That's a strange thing for a hospital's own CFO to be worried about, I said. Charity spending. I'd think you'd have bigger line items to lose sleep over. Something flickered behind his eyes, there and controlled almost as fast as it appeared. Almost not quite fast enough. I worry about everything that touches this institution's finances, he said. It's the job. Is it? I kept my voice mild, the way I used to keep it mild across a conference table full of people who thought a waitress plain face meant a waitress plain mind. Because from where I'm sitting, you drove up here yourself on a Tuesday morning to talk to a patient about billing you just told me she isn't responsible for. That's not oversight. That's attention, and men like you don't spend attention on things that don't threaten them. His face did something complicated, surprise first, quickly buried, then something colder underneath it. You should rest, Miss Ashby, he said, already moving for the door. Childbirth can make people say strange things. He left without waiting for an answer, and I lay there with my heart going harder than it had any right to, some old dormant machinery in my chest turning over for the first time in 5 years, whispering that I had just watched a guilty man overplay a hand he didn't know I could read. I didn't tell Marlo about it that night. I told myself it was because she looked exhausted, dark circles bruised under her eyes from a board meeting that had clearly gone badly, sitting in the visitor's chair with her tie loosened and her composure fraying at exactly one thread. I told myself I'd tell her tomorrow. They want a vote, she said, staring at nothing. On my judgment. My fitness, technically, that's the word Dorian used in the memo. Whether housing a patient in a donor suite for a week constitutes a conflict of interest requiring board review. A short, humorless laugh. 6 years. I've never once had my fitness questioned. Then I hold one stranger's hand in an elevator, and suddenly I'm a liability. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it fully this time. This is because of me. No, her eyes found mine. Fierce in a way I hadn't seen yet, not the controlled steadiness of the elevator, but something raw underneath it. This is because of him. Dorian's wanted my seat since before I inherited it. He's needed a reason for 3 years. I just handed him the first one that looked plausible. She reached over, not for my hand exactly, just close enough that our fingers brushed on the blanket, testing, "I'm not sorry I did it. I want you to know that. Whatever the vote says." I turned my hand over, palm up, an answer instead of a word, and she laced her fingers through mine slow enough that I could have pulled away at any point and didn't. Iris stirred in the bassinet, made a small sound, settled. Outside, the city glittered on, indifferent, and inside that room something between us had stopped being uncertain and started being simply true, unspoken but no longer deniable, right up until Priya knocked twice, sharp, and said the words that cut the evening clean in half. "Dr. Sterling, you need to see this. It's on the 6 o'clock news." The story ran under a banner that made my stomach drop before a single word of it registered. Hospital heiress houses mystery woman in VIP suite. Sources question favoritism. Finances, there was a photo of me from the diner, lifted off some old social post, captioned waitress, unemployed prior to hospital stay. There was a quote, unnamed source, close to the family, alleging that Marlowe had been seen showing unusual personal interest in a patient with a documented history of workplace termination for financial misconduct. Financial misconduct. Not fired for asking questions, misconduct. The word sat in my mouth like a stone. "That's not what happened," I said, before Marlowe could ask. 5 years ago, I worked compliance for an auditing firm, contracted out to hospital systems, reviewing insurance billing for fraud patterns. I found one. A big one. My report went up the chain and came back down as inconclusive, employee overreach, and 3 weeks later I was let go because I never got a straight answer on, and every reference call after that came back the same way. Vague, cold, done. I didn't do anything wrong. I found something somebody didn't want found. Marlowe's face had gone very still, the particular stillness I now recognized as her holding something enormous behind a locked door. "What hospital system?" she said. I told her the name. It wasn't Sterling. It was a smaller regional chain, 3 states over, one I hadn't thought about in years because thinking about it only ever led back to the same dead end. Who signed off on the review that called it inconclusive, Marlowe said, and her voice had gone dangerously quiet. I hadn't seen the name in 5 years. It came back anyway, the way names do when they've been waiting under the surface the whole time. A contracted financial consultant, Vance and Holt Advisory. The room went very silent. Priya, still standing by the door, made a small sound like she'd been struck. Marlowe closed her eyes for one long second, and when she opened them again, the softness I'd started to know her by had burned off entirely, replaced by something colder and older and absolutely, finally, focused. Dorian Vance ran an advisory firm before he came to Sterling, she said. 19 years ago, before my father hired him as CFO. I've read his employment file 100 times and never once connected it to anything, because there was nothing to connect it to. Her jaw worked. Until now. Marlowe, I sat up straighter, the machinery in my chest that had gone quiet for 5 years turning over fully now, loud, insistent, awake, the clotting agent. The supply order that came in short the year Eleanor died. Who approved procurement budgets that year? I watched the question land in her like a blow she'd been braced for without knowing it. He did, she said. He's approved every procurement budget for 19 years. Her hands, on the blanket, had curled into fists so slow and controlled I almost didn't see it happen. He's the one who cut maintenance contracts 18 months ago, elevators included. I signed off on his recommendation because he'd never once given me a reason to double-check him. Her eyes came up to mine, and there was something almost like grief in them, and something else underneath the grief that was worse, colder, absolutely certain. You were in that elevator because of a maintenance budget he cut. My wife died because of a supply order he approved. And you were run out of a job 5 years ago because you found the exact shape of what he's been doing ever since, and nobody was ready to hear it. I can prove it, I said, and something in me that had been sleeping for 5 years sat all the way up, sharp and clear, and finally useful. If I still have my old files. If the pattern's the same. Skimmed maintenance budgets, padded procurement invoices, the difference routed through a shell consulting fee, that's exactly what I found before. If he's still doing it here, it'll be in the same shape. Numbers don't change their handwriting. Marlowe looked at me for a long moment, something fierce and startled and entirely undisguised moving across her face. "You're extraordinary," she said, quiet, like she was only now fully understanding it. "I'm tired and I'm angry and I have a week-old baby," I said. "But yes, also that." The smile that broke over her face then was the first unguarded one I'd seen, brief and real and gone too fast, because the next second Priya's phone buzzed against her hip, and her expression changed, and she said, in a voice gone tight and careful, "Dr. Sterling, security's calling. There's a man in the lobby with a lawyer and a camera crew, and he's telling them he's here to take his daughter home." They came up together, Grant with a lawyer in a stiff gray suit and a photographer trailing 2 steps behind, filming, because a story about a mystery woman in a donor suite plays better with footage of a father fighting for his child, even a father who hadn't paid a cent in 8 months and had signed nothing. Marlowe blocked the doorway before any of them cleared the threshold, and I will remember, for the rest of my life, the particular sound of her voice when she said, "This is a private medical floor. You have 5 seconds to explain why you're filming inside it before I have every one of you arrested for trespassing on a patient's private care unit." "She's not just a patient," Grant said, jabbing a finger past her shoulder toward me, toward the bassinet, toward everything he'd never once come to see in 8 months of silence. "That's my kid. I've got rights." "You have a trespass notice," Marlowe said, "filed 6 days ago after you put your hands on hospital security. You want to talk about rights? We can talk about that instead, on camera if your lawyer thinks that's the story he wants running tonight." The lawyer went pale. Grant did not. "You think buying her a fancy room makes this yours to control? Everyone's already saying it. You're keeping her here, paying her off. People want to know why a billionaire is suddenly playing house with a waitress she met in an elevator. I don't know exactly what happened in me at playing house. Something that had been coiled tight for 8 months simply let go. I got up out of that bed, too soon, my body screaming about it, and I did it anyway, and walked to the doorway and looked at the man who had left me alone with a positive test and a truck title he cared more about than his daughter's name. "You want the real story?" My voice came out steadier than I felt, steady the way it had been in the diner, steady the way I'd learned to be when the alternative was breaking in public where people could watch. "The real story is a woman delivered my daughter with her bare hands in a stalled elevator because the man standing behind you couldn't be bothered to answer his phone. The real story is I've worked 11-hour shifts 8 months pregnant because he took the only vehicle either of us owned and never looked back. And the real story, since your camera's rolling, is that Dorian Vance, the man who runs this hospital's finances, cut the maintenance budget that stalled that elevator using the exact same fraud scheme he used to end my career 5 years ago at a different hospital, and I have the numbers to prove every word of it." So point that camera somewhere useful. The photographer, to his credit, had already swung the lens toward me and was not moving it back. Grant's lawyer put a hand on his arm, murmuring something urgent about liability. Grant shook it off, opened his mouth to say something else, and Marlo stepped between us, close enough that her scent, black tea, rain on slate, steady as a held breath, folded around me like a wall going up on my side for once instead of against me. "You're done here," she said to Grant, quiet and final. "Sign the certificate relinquishing parental claim, or spend the next year in court proving to a judge you weren't just here for the cameras. Either way, you're leaving this floor now." He left. The lawyer left faster. The photographer lingered a beat too long, and Marlo turned that same quiet final voice on him instead. "Everything you just filmed. Print it. All of it. I'll be surprised if it says what he wanted it to." And then it was just the two of us and Priya and the closing door, and I sat down hard on the edge of the bed because my legs had finally, entirely, stopped being willing to hold me up. "You didn't have to say all that," Marlo said, crouching in front of me the way she had in the elevator, hands steady on my knees. "Yes, I did." My voice cracked on it, the adrenaline finally draining out and leaving something raw underneath. "I've spent 5 years letting people decide what my story was. I'm done doing that." She looked at me for a long moment, something enormous moving behind her eyes, and then she said, low, like a vow made to no one but the two of us, "Then let's finish it." Properly, not with a stray comment to a camera crew, with numbers he can't argue with, in front of a board he can't buy. Her thumb moved once, slow, across the back of my hand. "Will you help me end him?" "I thought you'd never ask," I said, and for the first time in 8 months, when I laughed, it didn't hurt. It took 6 days to build the case, and I did most of it from a hospital bed with a laptop Marlo brought without asking, and a stack of 5-year-old files I still had backed up under a name that wasn't my own, because some part of me had always known I might need them again. The pattern was exactly what I remembered, down to the bone, maintenance and procurement invoices routed through a shell firm called Holt Advisory, the same Holt from Vance and Holt, 19 years buried and never once cross-checked, skimming an average of 11% off every contract for 2 decades. The difference laundered through consulting fees nobody in finance had ever bothered to itemize because Dorian Vance himself signed off on the itemization. Marlo brought me the current year's procurement ledger on the 4th day, and I found the elevator maintenance line item within 20 minutes, a contract cut by 60% 18 months ago. The exact 18 months since Marlo had taken full control and Vance had needed, for the first time in his career, to hide his numbers from someone who might actually read them. I found the clotting agent supply order from 6 years ago on the 5th day, buried 3 folders deep in an archive Marlo hadn't looked at since the internal review closed it. And the invoice discrepancy sat there in black and white. $22,000 skimmed off a procurement contract, the same quarter the order came in short. I watched Marlo read that page. I watched her go somewhere very far away and very cold, and I put my hand over hers on the table before she could go further than I could follow her back from. "He killed her," Marlo said, not a question. "He stole from a budget line that got her killed," I said, gently as I could make it land. Whether that's the same thing in a courtroom, I don't know, but it's the same thing everywhere else that matters. She was quiet a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were wet and furious in equal measure, and she said, "I want to burn every version of him to the ground." I know. I laced my fingers through hers. But do it in the light, in front of everyone, with numbers he can't spin. Not in a room alone with him, where nobody's watching what it costs you to do it. You've spent 6 years making sure this hospital never hurts anyone the way it hurt you. Don't let this be the thing that turns you into the reason it does." Something in her face broke and settled at once, like a wave finally reaching shore. "When did you get so wise?" she murmured. "Somewhere around the 4th budget line," I said, and she laughed, wet and startled, and pressed her forehead to mine for one long, quiet moment before either of us said another word. The board meeting was called for the following Tuesday, officially to vote on Marlowe's fitness, the very weapon Dorian had built for her downfall. She walked in with me beside her, Iris asleep in a carrier against my chest, 2 weeks old and utterly unaware she was about to become the reason a 19-year fraud finally came apart. I stood at the head of that long table in front of 11 board members who had never once had reason to look twice at a waitress, and I put 19 years of numbers on the screen behind me, 1 page at a time. And I said, in the same voice I'd used across a different conference table 5 years earlier, the one that had cost me everything then and would not cost me anything now, "This is the pattern. This is who benefited. And this is the day it stops." Dorian Vance sat very still through the first 4 slides. By the 6th, his composure had started to crack at the seams, the practiced stillness giving way to something younger and uglier underneath. "This is absurd," he said, too loud for the room. A grief-addled amateur and a waitress, cobbling together coincidences. "The invoice numbers aren't a coincidence, Dorian," Marlowe's voice cut clean through his, quiet and absolutely level. "They're your signature. Literally, page 11. He looked at page 11. Something in him gave out. "You don't understand what it costs to run a system this size," he said, and it came out fast now, unraveling. The confession nobody had asked for spilling out of a man who'd spent 19 years believing he'd never have to give one. "Margins are nothing. Nothing. I built Holt Advisory before you were even born into this, before your father knew what a supply chain was. I earned every dollar I ever skimmed keeping this place solvent while your family collected the credit. Eleanor's death wasn't. That was an accident, a coincidence, a supply chain error that could have happened to anyone. It could have," Marlowe said, and her voice had gone very soft, very dangerous, except it happened because of you. "And the woman standing next to me could have died in an elevator you starved of maintenance funding to protect a fraud you've been running since before I was born. 2 women, 6 years apart, both nearly paid for your arithmetic with their lives. That's not an accident, Dorian, that's a pattern. And I have the pattern now, in writing, in your own signature, in front of 11 witnesses, and a security recording that's been running since the meeting opened." The silence after that lasted a long time. Then, the chair of the audit committee, a woman named Holloway, who I'd exchanged perhaps 4 words with in my life, said quietly, "I'll call the district attorney's office myself," and the room began to move again. All at once, like a held breath, finally let go. They walked Dorian Vance out of Sterling Memorial in handcuffs 40 minutes later, past the same lobby he'd once told me was worth $8,000 a night, past nurses and orderlies and the same security guard whose arm he'd once ordered removed from Grant, all of them watching in a silence that had 19 years of quiet resentment folded into it. Marlowe stood at my side. Her hand found mine, and for the first time since the amber light had gone out in that stalled elevator, I felt something in my chest unclench all the way. "Ask me with your words," Marlowe said quietly, later, when the hallway had emptied, and it was just the 2 of us and Iris asleep between us in her carrier. "Whatever this is, I don't want to guess at it anymore. Kiss me," I said, "and then ask me the rest tomorrow, when I've slept more than 3 hours in a row." She laughed, really laughed, the sound rusty with disuse and lovely for exactly that reason, and kissed me slow and careful in a hallway that 6 days ago had been a stranger's fluorescent-lit corridor and was now, unmistakably, becoming home. The press conference ran 2 days later, and this time, Marlowe controlled every word of it. She stood at a podium in the same lobby Dorian had once tried to buy with condescension, laid out the fraud in plain language for cameras that had, a week earlier, been hunting a scandal about favoritism, and found instead a story about a man who'd stolen from budgets that got a resident killed and nearly killed a woman in labor. She named Eleanor. She named the maintenance contract. She did not name me as anything but the woman whose competence uncovered 19 years of theft this institution should have caught itself, and I watched, from the side of the room with Iris against my shoulder, 5 years of quiet shame finally, publicly, come undone. Grant's story ran too, smaller, buried on page 4 of the same outlet that had once run his photo op, a follow-up piece on the trespass notice, the abandoned support payments, the signed relinquishment he'd been strong-armed into by his own lawyer once the cameras stopped being friendly. Doreen called the hospital line 2 days after that, asking, in a voice gone syrupy with sudden pride, whether I might want my old shifts back, now that things had worked out so nicely. I let Priya field that call. I understand she was not gentle about it. 6 weeks after the elevator doors first closed on the two of us, on a night when Iris had finally started sleeping in longer stretches, and my body had finally started feeling like it belonged to me again, Marlowe sat across from me on the small balcony off what had, by then, quietly become both our apartment, and took both my hands in hers. "Tell me to stop, and I will," she said low, and I understood she wasn't only talking about the kiss she hadn't yet leaned into. Any of it. All of it. Say the word, and we stay exactly where we are. For as long as you need. "I don't want you to stop," I said. "I want you to ask me properly. Whatever it is you've been circling for a week." Something in her face cracked open, unguarded, entirely undefended, the way it had been only once before, in the amber dark of a stalled elevator. "I want to bond with you," she said. "Not tonight, not until you tell me your body's ready, not until every part of this is something you've chosen with your whole self, and not just your heart in a rush. But I want you to know I'm not asking because of an elevator, or gratitude, or grief looking for somewhere to land. I'm asking because I have not stopped thinking about the sound you made when you told a room full of powerful men to point their cameras somewhere useful, and I don't want to spend one more day of my life without that sound in it. Ask me with your words," I said again, softer this time, and watched her understand exactly what I was asking her to say out loud. "Wren Ashby." Her thumb moved slow across my knuckles. "Will you let me claim you? Will you let me be yours, the way I already know I'm going to spend the rest of my life being?" "Yes," I said, and the word came out steady, certain, nothing like the shaking hands that had once held a positive test alone in a bathroom 8 months earlier. "Yes, Marlowe, all of it." The bite, when it came 3 weeks later, on a night we'd both chosen with clear heads and open eyes, was gentle in a way I hadn't expected from a woman capable of shutting down a board of 11 with a single sentence, her mouth at the curve of my throat, her hands cradling my jaw like something breakable and precious at once, a whispered "tell me if it's too much against my skin" before her teeth found the mark, and the bond that opened between us afterward hit like a window thrown open in a room that had been shut up for years, warm air rushing into every corner at once. I felt her relief before I heard it in her voice. I felt 6 years of grief, finally, quietly, exhale. The proposal came 4 months later in the roof garden on the 9th floor, on the bench with Eleanor's name on the plaque, which Marlo had chosen not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Because, she told me, kneeling in the morning light with a small worn box that had belonged to her grandmother, she wanted her wife to know, in whatever way the dead know things, that the woman who came after her had not erased her, but had been welcomed, gently, into the same garden. I told her about you, Marlo said, ring balanced on her palm, Iris 6 months old and gumming a fistful of Marlo's collar in my arms beside her. I come up here most months, and I told her. I think she'd have liked you. She had no patience for people who let bullies win either. Marlo Sterling, I said, laughing and crying at once, are you asking me something or telling me a story? Both, she said, and asked, and I said yes before she'd finished the sentence, and Iris shrieked with the pure delighted violence of a baby who has no idea what's happening but knows the day is good. We married in the autumn, small, in that same garden, under a sky doing exactly what October skies do best. Priya stood up as a witness and cried through the entire thing, which she denied fiercely and often afterward. Marlo's chief of staff, a gruff, unsentimental man named Foster, who'd known her 15 years and had never once seen her miss a meeting for anything short of surgery, gave a toast that started as a joke about her legendary punctuality and ended, unexpectedly, with his voice breaking on the line. In 15 years, I never once saw her wait for anyone. I've never been happier to be wrong. Doreen was not invited. Grant's name did not come up once all day, which felt like its own kind of ending. Dorian Vance pled guilty 11 months later to 2 counts of grand fraud and 1 of falsifying hospital procurement records, and was sentenced to 9 years, of which the judge specifically noted the elevator incident and the supply order incident as aggravating factors in her ruling. Holt Advisory's remaining assets were seized and, at Marlo's insistence, redirected in full toward a maintenance and safety endowment named, over Marlo's initial flustered protest, for Eleanor, whose name now sits on a small brass plate beside every elevator in the building, a promise carved into metal that nothing that unmaintained anything, ever again, would be allowed to nearly cost someone their life the way it once did. Twice, 6 years apart. A year on from the night the lights went out in an elevator between the 3rd and 4th floor, I sat by the window of a home that finally, fully, belonged to both of us, finishing the gray knit blanket I'd started, unfinished, in a plastic bag under a diner counter the week before Iris was born, the one I'd never had the hours or the peace of mind to complete, needles set aside in a panic the same night my water broke. Marlo came in from the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea, black, the same steady scent that had first told me, in the dark, that I wasn't alone anymore, and set one down beside me, and looked at the blanket finally whole across my lap, and said nothing at all, because some things don't need saying twice. Morning light came through the window the way it had in that first private suite, gold and unhurried, falling across Iris asleep in her mother's arms, across the finished blanket, across the 2 of us sitting close enough that our scents had long since stopped being 2 separate things and started being simply one. It is a strange thing. To spend years invisible and then be seen so completely, it rearranges the shape of you. I used to think being overlooked was a wound that scarred over and stayed closed. I know now it only closes when someone decides, on purpose, every single day, to keep looking. Being chosen was never the miracle. Being chosen by someone who never once looked away, that was the end.